Hello, my dears and queers. Welcome to tonight's discussion. Before we get started, however, let's just get something covered. This is going to be a heavy one. There will be discussions of mental health, assault, falsified realities, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide. If that's something that you're uncomfortable with, maybe sit this one out. It's going to be a bit of a ride. For those of you who are still with me, let's get comfortable. Our heroes in Star Trek are known for being able to put up with some serious and potentially deadly situations, and they always come out pretty okay in the end. Look at Riker in The Next Generation. Duplicated. Everything that happens in Frame of Mind. Kidnapped and dragged off into a subspace reality. Turned into a proto-caveman. And do I even need to mention what happens in The Royale? Ugh. Now, this is of course the product of serialized television and how it was made back in the day. Characters had arcs, but really they were more when the writers backpedaled on certain aspects of a personality and pushed towards others, like dialing down the annoying in Series 1 Julian by about 80%. I joke, of course, but television has changed. Characters have changed. We see a lot of different responses to different situations. New Trek is being known for dark and gritty and ultra-real depictions of suffering. Something old Trek never did. Or did it? Enter Chief Petty Officer Miles Edward O'Brien. Husband, father, engineer, friend, problem solver, family man, and damn it, the toughest dude in Starfleet. To say O'Brien suffers is an understatement. He has gone through the hardest of hard times in his life. He's been a political prisoner on multiple occasions, duplicated, lost to time, died, held captive by the Dominion more than once, and shot a hecking load of times. I mean, damn, that shoulder will just not stop dislocating. Thank God for 24th century medicine. Injuries are a strange thing in fiction. Characters will suffer from all sorts of injuries they've been dealt, but they will always get better and get right back up on their feet before the credits roll. Because there are heroes, and that's what heroes do. They always get back up. And Miles does his best. He's been hurt a lot, but he's right back up it by next week, ready to face the problems of the week. There's nothing that man can't solve. Unless perhaps it's a problem of the self. So, to catch everyone up, HardTime is the 19th episode from Series 4 in Deep Space Nine. Probably one of the strongest episodes from the series, certainly in terms of acting from Col Meany, who carries the entire weight of the episode on his back. The story focuses on Miles, of course, having just come out of a simulated experience of a 20-year prison sentence for the crime of espionage. Before the Federation could intervene, he is forced to live a simulated life experience in a single cell for 20 years, with little food or company. It is a terrible and cruel experience. This episode opens with Miles in the dregs of his uniform, hair matted and long, gently tracing shapes in the sand. When he finishes up, his door opens and two guards tell him he's being released. He can't quite comprehend the concept. He's been in this room for 20 years and now he's being let go. Then the rug is pulled out from under our feet. As he is thrown back into the light, he wakes up next to Major Kira. None of it was real, but the impact it will have on him in his life in this episode will be real enough. On returning to Deep Space Nine, O'Brien tries to adjust to his life back on board the station, but his experiences while imprisoned still trouble him. Although he tells Dr. Bashir that he was alone in prison, flashbacks reveal to the audience that he had a cellmate, Ichar, who taught him how to survive while incarcerated. He begins slowly to exhibit habitual behaviours that he picked up while he was incarcerated, such as hoarding food and sleeping on the hard floor instead of his bed. Then, when questioned if he was alone all this time, he begins to suffer from hallucinations of Ichar. Over time, O'Brien becomes increasingly irritable and more reclusive. He has an altercation with Bashir and assaults Quark while he waits to be served in the bar. Captain Sisko later relieves O'Brien of duty, placing him on medical leave and ordering him to attend counselling sessions that he's been avoiding. After he returns to his quarters, things come to a head when he almost hits his daughter Molly when she was just trying to get his attention. He flees to a cargo bay and starts to vent his anger and self-loathing by tearing the place apart. Eventually, he comes across a weapons locker, takes a phaser, setting it to maximum, prepared to take his own life. Bashir follows O'Brien and finds him just in time. O'Brien tells Bashir how he killed Ichar over a few pieces of bread that he was saving for the both of them, and the guilt that has just been eating away at his conscience. O'Brien is convinced that he is an animal, but Bashir tells him that if he truly were an animal, he would have had no regret for killing Ichar. And so O'Brien is human, still deep down inside. Bashir ultimately prescribes a new course of heavy treatment, and soon O'Brien is on his way to recovery. In that last moment, however, O'Brien saw that he was becoming a violent man, angry with himself and fueled with a loathing that he could not comprehend. In a desperate act to stop his pain and keep others safe, he was prepared to end his life. It's a heavy episode, and probably one of the most out of place within that specific era of Star Trek. The classic show rarely deals with mental health, to at least the levels that we see here. Miles goes through hell and back from start to finish. It's a powerful force to be reckoned with. He sees the edge and manages to take a step back. We even see him at the end with a hypospray of what I'm assuming is an antidepressant, which could be the first sign of, medical treatment for mental health that isn't just talking to your local betazoid. Of course, O'Brien gets better. There's no mention of these incidents in future episodes, though we know now as a character, he has changed from those events. And like all trauma and traumatic events that happen to us as people, whether we talk about them or not, those events stay with us. Oh boy, this one is rough. So, depression depicted in television has gotten more nuanced and complicated over the last few years. In fact, at the time of writing, probably the most important and memorable show happening right now is WandaVision, a show about grief, how we cope and how it affects us all. Wanda creates a world that, while is fantastical, is still grounded in a form of grief that is so very powerful, forming in its own terrible disassociation from reality, trying to push away from that sorrow. Another Marvel-led series, Jessica Jones, has the central theme of trauma and depression as a character who struggles with both. In an interview with Melissa Rosenberg, she told the Los Angeles Times, "Playing them as honestly as possible was very much the objective from the beginning. The tone is meant to be very grounded and real, so you have to be very grounded and real with whatever subjects you're dealing with. So there was no glossing this over. It was really an exploration of a survivor and her healing, to the degree that she does in facing those demons quite literally. When we see O'Brien trying to avoid his demons in HardTime, he wants to distance himself from the events that caused him to hurt. He doesn't want to see a counselor, he doesn't want to talk about what happened to anyone. Eventually he does face his demons, he does talk about what happened, but in the beginning he just wants to put what happened to him in a box and never look at it. Though anyone who has ever suffered from any form of personal trauma or has struggled with depression knows that what you throw away doesn't always stay away. It's understandable though. Lives can be unwound, changed and reconstructed by something that is so complex, it's hard to take it in. So many people just want to embrace what they know, the normalcy of familiar, the structure of something that they all want. Many people fear that by going back into therapy and talking about what happened may force themselves to relive the trauma and hurt them again. Or worse, they can be judged for what they did, perceived as weak for being unable to cope. It's sometimes a difficult road to follow because we know we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, yes, this happened. And sometimes it's even worse. We believe these things that happen because of some sort of failing of ourselves as a person. And to examine the events of what happened to us means looking at ourselves. And if we were to feel that our own personhood is toxic, we may go no further and have no further understanding. We may go no further than scratching the surface to uncover a deeper and more complex truth. Whatever it was never our fault. However, Miles blames himself for the death of Ichar, even though it was never real. The memory was fabricated, it was real to him, and the emotional weight of it was real to him. HR is hanging around with him for most of the episode as a hallucination. Now, this could very well be artistic shorthand for Miles to work through his feelings, because the scenes with Cole Meany and Craig Wasson are great to watch, but with the story it becomes the simple act of giving someone the chance to confront their guilt. HR is a personification of Miles's regret for all those years alone, but that guilt just wants Miles to be okay. In the end, HR only vanishes once Miles asks for help, telling him to be well. Maybe because there's a part of Miles that knows he will be well now, or because he's starting to finally accept that what happened in that cell over 20 years ago wasn't his fault, but a synthesized product of a system that decided it was easier to brutally hurt a person than it was to reform them. Also, can we talk about how this episode has some brilliant and not so subtle commentary on the general notion of prisons? Because I think we really need to talk about that sometime. But hold on now, I hear you call out. These are goofy fictional characters who live in space with laser guns and robots. What has that got to do with the real world? The line between fiction and reality is thinner than you'd think. It's permeable and soft enough for things to travel both ways. Hell, sometimes it's a revolving door that just spins like there's no tomorrow, baby. But it's never a solid divide. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, art imitates life, while life inspires art. Sometimes what we see on the screen are things we need to see, dressed up with spaceships and laser guns. There are stories we need to look at, to deconstruct, to talk about and more fully understand. From the outside of this box, the episode could be labelled simply as another O'Brien must suffer episode, which is an honest, if shallow analysis of the story. But on the inside, that's when it gets more interesting. On the inside, it's asking the viewer to understand the struggles of someone who undergoes a life-changing trauma. The audience is shown what can happen, the struggles, the emotions, how a person can feel so helpless in the end. And while a person can tell them they will get better, sometimes they will just need a person to intervene. It's not about being a brutally honest portrayal, but it is showing what it can be like for those of us who struggle and suffer. It's the treatment of O'Brien in the show. It's one of care. While the story beats him with a pain stick, no one ever gives up on him. At no point do any of the other characters turn around and go, well, he doesn't want to be helped. They don't know what he needs help with, not until the end. But Bashir was able to break through to him, to help him get better. It's an important part of the episode to recognise that no one wanted O'Brien to just get back to things. They wanted to help, even if they didn't know how. Episodes like these are important, especially with Star Trek's idea of hopefulness. The best way to fight despair is with hope. So, I suffer with depression. Always have, and very likely always will. But I manage it with healthy outlets, my support network, and all sorts of other tips and tricks. I strongly relate to O'Brien in this episode. The pattern of his life is one of struggling to cope with something that has fundamentally rewritten who he is. And I could spend a good deal of time relating these ideas and concepts that I feel is represented in his arc. But that would be a long story. One of the big things, however, for me, is being frank about my depression. I try not to shut her away too much, because otherwise it becomes this little taboo that you don't talk about. And then it becomes even harder to talk about. So I keep it out in the open. I destigmatize it to myself. For a while I didn't, and I kept it super bottled up, and it led to what I would affectionately call the whoopsie bad day. That title is a little more glib than it has any right to be, but it's what I call it. If it's open on the table, people know to ask me if I'm doing okay. And more importantly, if it's out on the table, I can look at it and decide when it's time to ask for help. Much like HR said, know yourself and be well. So, what does this do with having to wrap this all together? Well, like I said, you combat despair with hope. You combat an episode about depression with the knowledge that you'll get better. This episode, while pulling into one of the lowest moments for a character has ever been in Trek, we get to see the hope that breaks him free from that moment. Representation for people of all walks of life is important, no more important than those who are struggling. DS9's episode HardTime is a masterstroke of not just showing us hurt, but showing us people who hurt getting better. If I'm allowed to go off script a little here, the idea of showing a person depressed is commonplace enough. It's pretty much a trope now that you have the dark, brooding, angsty character. They're 10 a penny in most shows. Even Star Trek is kind of guilty of it doing now in the modern era. But having a character who gets better, the crux of their arc not being them sinking to the low, but actually rising out of it, the important part of their person is regaining control of their life and finding a direction to take themselves in, is important now more than ever. We live in a world that is the most uncertain of times, and even when I was drafting this script, I didn't know how much thinking about this was going to personally affect me. Like I said earlier, I struggle with depression, and it's a big part of who I am sometimes, and sometimes it weighs heavily on my shoulders, and sometimes I do come back to this episode thinking, that was important to see. In my earlier years when I saw this story, I saw a bigger thing than I could really comprehend. I watched this story maybe when I was about 10, maybe even younger, and seeing a character so low, reaching such a point, was informative, because then I realized years later that, you can break out of that moment. It's difficult, and it is like pulling teeth. It's not as easy as the episode depicts it, but that's why that's why I'm talking about this now. The episode's depiction of people getting help, showing that people do care about you, the viewer. If you are a viewer who suffers with depression, you get to see the outside of this act. You get to see people caring about O'Brien, even while he's not in the room. They say he is struggling, we don't know how to help, but we want to help them. Sometimes when you're depressed, you sit alone and you worry because you think that no one cares. But in the end, people do care. You don't see that. And it's important that we have those scenes, that we show Keiko, we show Sisko, we show these people worrying about him, trying to find a way to make his life better. Because if you are struggling, there are people trying to help you to make your life better. You just don't see it. I don't think it's possible to say much more. But perhaps the words of Edith Keeler from the classic series episode, City on the Edge of Forever, will add something of substance to this video. And the men that reach out to space will be able to find ways to feed the hungry millions of the world and cure their diseases. They will be able to find a way to give each man hope and a common future. Those are the days worth living for. Take care out there.